Picture this, a crowded marketplace in Victorian England. The smell of horse dung and coal smoke fills the air. Merchants shout, coins clink, and children dart between wagons. But in the middle of it all stands a wooden auction block. A man grips a coarse leather halter tied around the wrist of a woman, his wife. He yanks her forward like cattle, lifting her chin for strangers to examine. The crowd laughs, some jeer, others cheer. The woman's face burns with shame, and then with the slam of a hammer and the exchange of a few shillings, she is sold. Not a piece of furniture, not a beast of burden, but a living, breathing human being. This isn't a secret slave market hidden from the law. This is open, public, and disturbingly common in 19th century Britain, a society that prided itself on morality, progress, and family values. Why would respectable men humiliate their wives like this? Why would the law look the other way, and why did crowds treat it like entertainment? If you enjoy hidden truths like this, hit subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because in this story lies the shocking hypocrisy of the Victorian world, a society that preached sanctity of marriage, yet turned women into property to be bartered, traded, and discarded. Stay with me because the truth behind wife selling will reveal something far darker about Victorian men and the society that enabled them. Mini cliffhanger. To understand why this practice existed, we need to step back into a world where marriage was not love, but a contract sealed in iron chains. To understand why men in Victorian Britain sold their wives, you first need to step into the heart of that society. The 19th century was a paradox. On one hand, the Industrial Revolution was transforming cities into roaring engines of progress. Railways crisscrossed the land, factories belched smoke into the east skies, and Britain ruled the seas with its empire. The Victorians liked to call their age civilized, moral, and modern. But beneath this polished surface lay a darker truth. Marriage in this world was not about romance. It was a transaction, a contract, and for women it was often a prison. Once a woman married, her legal identity essentially vanished. The doctrine of coverture declared that a wife and her property were absorbed into her husband's control. Her wages, her belongings, even her body, all legally belonged to him. Divorce was technically possible, but only the wealthy could afford it, and it carried such social shame that most avoided it at all costs. For the working poor, trapped in grinding poverty, there was no realistic escape. And so, in towns and villages across England, desperate men invented their own crude solution. If you were a husband who no longer wanted your wife, maybe you quarreled, maybe she couldn't bear children, maybe you simply fell out of love, you didn't go to court. You took her to the market, you tied a rope around her arm, or even around her neck like a cow or a horse, and you sold her to another man. It was not legal, not officially sanctioned, but the law often turned a blind eye, treating it as a custom of the working class. Newspapers of the time are filled with reports of these sales. Sometimes the wife went willingly, desperate to escape a cruel husband. Other times she stood weeping while strangers bid for her. Imagine it. The clang of the auctioneer's bell, the murmur of the crowd, the woman's eyes darting desperately as men sized her up. For the price of a few beers, a marriage could be dissolved in the public square. And this practice persisted well into the 19th century, in an era of Queen Victoria, steam engines, and supposed refinement. The contradiction is almost unbearable, a society obsessed with honour and virtue, yet casually treating wives as property to be discarded. But how did this grim custom rise in the first place? How did it become so widespread that ordinary men believed they had the right to sell their wives? Mini cliffhanger. To answer that, we must follow the rise of this strange tradition, from whispers in rural markets to a spectacle that even the newspapers couldn't ignore. The origins of wife selling were humble, whispered more than recorded. It began in rural England, among farm labourers and miners, men whose lives were ruled by poverty and backbreaking work. For them, marriage was not always a sanctuary, but another burden. A quarrelsome wife, an unhappy home, or simply the crushing weight of poverty could push a man to seek escape. And escape was nearly impossible. Divorce in the 18th and early 19th centuries was a privilege of the rich. It required Parliament's approval, lawyers, and fees that could cost a working man more than he would earn in a lifetime. For the poor, the idea was laughable. But desperation finds strange outlets, and so, quietly at first, men invented their own ritual, the public sale of a wife. At first, it may have been little more than symbolic. A man and his wife, both miserable, would agree to part. He would bring her to market, rope tied loosely around her wrist, and sell her to another man she preferred. Coins might exchange hands, ale might be bought, and the crowd would cheer. The woman was not so much property as a participant in a rough community divorce. But like all customs, it grew darker with repetition. What began as a symbolic gesture hardened into spectacle. Crowds gathered to watch, eager for gossip. Some whom men may have wanted freedom, but others had none. Their fates were decided in public, their dignity stripped by jeers and laughter. By the early 1800s, newspapers were reporting sales with lurid fascination. In 1832, one man sold his wife for 2 shillings and a dog. In another case, the exchange included a pint of beer. Some sales took place at village fairs, others in livestock markets where women stood beside sheep and cattle. The symbolism was clear. A wife was not a partner, but property. What is perhaps most disturbing is how normalized it became. To the working class, it was just how things were done. Local constables sometimes looked on without interference. Even the women themselves, beaten down by law and circumstance, sometimes went along willingly. For them, a new owner might mean a chance at survival or escape from a violent husband. And yet, lurking beneath this custom was something darker. It was more than poverty or lack of legal divorce. It was the belief that a woman's body, her will, her very life belonged not to her but to her husband. He could dispose of her as he pleased and society would watch. But every tradition meets its breaking point. For wife-selling, that moment came when spectacle collided with morality and when those in power could no longer look away. Mini cliffhanger. And the turning point came in scenes so public, so grotesque, that Victorian society itself began to shudder. For decades, wife-selling remained an unspoken tradition, tolerated, laughed at, even cheered on. But the Victorian age was obsessed with appearances, and cracks soon began to show. Britain liked to present itself as the pinnacle of morality, guided by Queen Victoria's image of family purity. Yet, in market squares across the country, men were still leading wives by halters and selling them like cattle. The turning point came when the practice became too visible, too grotesque to ignore. Newspapers seized on the most scandalous cases, transforming private misery into public spectacle. One such case took place in 1832 in the market town of Carlisle. A man marched his wife into the marketplace with a halter around her neck. A large crowd gathered, jeering and laughing as if it were a holiday fair. The woman was sold for a few shillings to another man, who led her away triumphantly. The local press described the scene in detail, noting the woman's humiliation, the man's drunken swagger, and the crowd's ghoulish amusement. Another infamous incident occurred in 1833, when a man sold his wife for a mere penny, the smallest coin in circulation. The shocking cheapness of the transaction revealed just how little value some men placed on their wives. The press covered the story with horror, framing it not as quaint tradition but as barbarism. Reformers pounced, religious leaders thundered from pulpits, condemning wife-selling as a disgrace to a Christian nation. Politicians too began to take notice, uneasy that Britain's global reputation for civilization was being mocked by its own people. If Britain claimed to lead the world, how could it allow women to be treated like livestock in broad daylight? For the first time, wife-selling was not dismissed as a local custom, but attacked as a stain on the nation's honour. The tone shifted. What had once been tolerated as the poor man's divorce was now portrayed as public indecency, an embarrassment, even a threat to the moral order. Yet even as authorities denounced it, the practice did not vanish overnight. Crowds still gathered, men still tied ropes, coins still exchanged hands. But now every sale carried risk. The newspapers might shame you, reformers might denounce you, and whispers began. Perhaps this ancient custom was not harmless after all. Still, resistance simmered. Many men clung to the ritual, insisting it was their right, their tradition. The obsession with control, the belief that a husband could dispose of his wife like property, was not so easily broken. And in this struggle between tradition and reform, the darkness of Victorian marriage became painfully clear. Mini cliffhanger. What followed were consequences that no one could ignore. Consequences that left lives shattered and revealed the true cruelty of a society that treated women as commodities. Behind the jeers of the crowd and the clink of coins lay lives shattered beyond repair. For every man who strutted from the marketplace boasting of a bargain, there was a woman who had just lost everything: her dignity, her security, even her sense of self. Some women went willingly, desperate to escape cruelty at home, but willing did not mean free. Their choice was between the lash of one husband or the uncertain mercy of another buyer. Imagine standing in front of a roaring crowd, rope biting your wrist, strangers staring at you as if you were meat on display. Even if you longed to escape, the humiliation seared into your skin forever. Others were not so fortunate. They were dragged to market against their will, shoved onto the auction block by men who laughed at their sobs. In one account from 1826, a woman tried to resist as her husband pulled her through the square, but he struck her down in front of the crowd. She was sold anyway, her tears dismissed as noise. And then there were the bargain sales, where wives were exchanged for beer, livestock, or a handful of coins. In 1832, a man traded his wife for a gallon of ale. The newspapers reported it with disgust, but to the people watching, it was entertainment. The woman in question became nothing more than a punchline, but the consequences stretched further. Children often stood in the crowd watching their mothers sold like cattle. Imagine the confusion of a child seeing the woman who had tucked them into bed now led away on a rope, replaced by a stranger. Families were ripped apart, trust shattered forever. For some women, the sale ended in even greater violence. A new owner might treat her worse than the last, emboldened by the idea that she had been purchased like property. Reports surfaced of women beaten, abandoned, or even starved after being sold. And yet society shrugged. After all, wasn't she just a wife, and therefore a husband's to command? The truth was unavoidable. Wife selling was not a quaint tradition, not harmless entertainment. It was legalized humiliation in disguise, an outlet for cruelty dressed as custom. It revealed the deep rot in Victorian marriage, a system that chained women to men, stripped them of rights, and laughed at their suffering. But the tide was turning. The consequences were too visible, too grotesque. Reformers demanded an end, newspapers fueled outrage, and the Victorian obsession with respectability began to strangle its own cruel tradition. Mini cliffhanger. And as the practice crumbled, what remained was the wreckage of countless lives, and a lesson Britain could never again ignore. By the mid-19th century, whispers of shame began to rise above the laughter of the crowds. What once drew curious eyes now sparked outrage. Newspapers that had once printed amused accounts of wife sales began condemning them as barbaric. Reformers, from churchmen to politicians, pointed to the markets as proof of Britain's moral decay. The Industrial Revolution was reshaping society. Cities were swelling with workers, education was spreading, and the idea that a wife was mere property no longer sat comfortably with a nation claiming to lead the world in progress. Each report of a wife sold for ale, for coins, or for cattle became a stain on Britain's image of respectability. In 1857, the Matrimonial Causes Act gave ordinary people the right to divorce through the courts, a legal escape from marriages that once seemed like prisons. Though still costly and unequal, it marked the beginning of the end. Now, couples no longer had to rely on the cruel spectacle of a public sale. Slowly, the markets quieted, the ropes disappeared, and the jeering crowds turned to other amusements. Yet the scars remained. For every woman who endured the market block, the humiliation was permanent. They lived on in silence, marked by whispers and memories of rope burns around their wrists. Children carried the trauma of watching their mothers sold, their families fractured before their eyes. And history, as always, preserved the contradictions. Some Victorians remembered the custom with nostalgia, dismissing it as harmless tradition. Others could never shake the image of women paraded like livestock while an entire community looked on. You, listening now, must ask yourself, what does it say about a society that allowed such cruelty to pass as custom? How many other injustices today wear the mask of tradition? The Victorians believed they were civilized, yet in their markets, civilization cracked to reveal something primal, something brutal. The lesson is hauntingly clear. Whenever power is unchecked, whenever one half of society is stripped of rights and dignity, abuse follows. Wife selling may be gone, but its shadow lingers as a warning that progress is fragile and humanity must be defended in every age. So the next time you hear the word Victorian, don't just picture lace and candlelight. Picture the rope, the auctioneer's voice, the crowd laughing as a woman's fate was sealed. Remember the victims and remember the silence that allowed it to continue for so long. If you've stayed with me through this disturbing journey, I thank you. Now I ask, subscribe for more hidden histories, share this story so others may learn, and tell me in the comments, what part of this tale shocked you the most?